Welcome to Research Renaissance, presented by the Karen Toffler Charitable Trust. Embark on a journey into the forefront of cutting-edge brain science as we feature insightful discussions with a diverse array of guests, from early career researchers pioneering groundbreaking science to influential voices in investment communities, policymaking, and research institutions. Together, we delve into neurological diseases, their causes, treatments, and the quest for cures. Join us in advancing our understanding of the brain and addressing its ailments. Welcome to Research Renaissance. I'm Deborah Westphal, your host and guide through the fascinating future of the brain. Joining me today is Dr. Lydia McClure, CEO of Research Bridge Partners. Today's discussion is focused on the investment community and its support to early researchers and entrepreneurs. Let's dive in. So welcome, Lydia. So glad to have you.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm really excited for this discussion. And before we get started, well, congratulations on your recent appointment to CEO. I think you took over at the beginning of the year. How's that going? And how's the transition like?
I did. I took over in October, so right before the holidays. It's been good. I've been with Research Bridge Partners for 8 years, so I know the organization well. We're a nonprofit. It has the mission to help faculty launch companies out of their research, and that's something I feel very deeply and passionate about. So taking over as CEO, it was the right next step, and the organization and the board has always been very supportive. So it felt really good.
Was there anything surprising when you stepped into this role, or is it still too new?
Not too surprising. Thankfully, at the role I had before had the breadth of understanding everything within the org. I think it was nice not having some of the kind of CEO stuff that you have to do, HR and signing off on things that now I have to sign off on, raising money in the ways, I'm the last one that everything falls onto. So you get used to it, but I have a very strong board and a good set of advisors. So it's been fun.
That's wonderful. Well, I'm sure you've got a long career ahead of you here with lots of learning. So I'll be excited to watch that, watch you make your moves there. You've had a very interesting career. You started as a researcher, and then you went into government, and it was more kind of policy and such. And then you're now in the investment community. Can you tell me a little bit about that journey, and what did you kind of those milestones, and what did you learn along the way?
Sure. It has been quite a journey so far. It's, as you said, just in the middle of the journey. So, I wasn't one of those PhD students who was taking classes outside of science or exploring other careers. I knew since I was a young child that I wanted to be a scientist. I grew up just outside of Berkeley, and my dad was at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. So he took me to Take Your Daughter to Work Day. And they had these amazing events at Take Your Daughter to Work Day at the lab. So, you could do fire the fire hose if you wanted to, or you could go into the labs and they let you tinker with, volumes of liquid and move it around. And it was just wonderful. And I really had this obsession as a child with Dr. Glenn Seaborg, who I'm not, unless you're a physicist or a chemist, you might not know who that is, but he was kind of the old realm of physicists. He has probably a dozen elements in the periodic table that he discovered or co-discovered. And I actually had him sign my periodic table. So, I knew early that I was going to get into science. And then as I was going through school, the human genome was sequenced. So that was a big trigger for me to get into molecular biology. I just really like DNA. Then I started learning about RNA. So in my PhD, I was one of the first to deep sequence a virus. So get all of the RNA sequence out of the virus and see what's happening inside of it. We were trying to discover what part of the virus allows it to evade our immune system. So why do some of the viruses like HIV and herpes you can have them for your whole life and not really know you have them. Or if your immune system gets knocked down, then the virus comes out. So what is keeping it hidden in our cells for so long? So, doing that deep sequencing, having the technology at this exact right time for us to study science, it just was such an enabler for us to move science. And that's when I knew that I wanted to really get involved in the innovation of science as well as science. So I tried to launch a company out of my PhD work in Austin, Texas. It didn't work for me, but I fell in love with startups and the energy of the investment community in Texas and life science community down there. And then I knew that if it was hard for me, it must be hard for every other academic. And this is really when I started to think about how academics are treated by venture. And it's not in a negative way. It's a different language. That scientists and venture and financiers speak different languages. And so it's sometimes hard to communicate and tell stories effectively. So I went back to UT Austin and started to help the faculty better understand how to move their technologies. And that's when the National Science Foundation, or NSF, they launched a program called Innovation Core, I-Core. And I was the first I-Core instructor in Texas. And it was I like to call it the scientific method for business. So it really enabled scientists to understand how to ask questions that they could answer about revenue or customer wants. I gave them a nice business model canvas to put their information on. So it was very data driven, and scientists loved that. Resonated really well. And I needed to move to DC. So I came to NSF and took over the I-Core program. And that's how the government, I'd never thought I'd be on the East Coast, for one thing, or in government. One of the first things they asked was if I would help move I-Core from bill to law, which they don't give you any training for that in PhD school, but it was a really nice way of better understanding who all the players are in the federal government. How does the White House work with Congress, and who are the individuals running those? How do we make sure that the details get written in correctly? So it was great. It was a really nice crash course in policy. But some of my colleagues back in Texas were launching Research Bridge Partners. It had a different name back then, but they asked if I would come, and I knew it was the right place for me, the right people, the right time, the right mission. So I moved over from NSF to Research Bridge Partners, and that's where I've been.
That's amazing. And the learning that went along the way here just kind of built upon each other. The bricks of your career are pretty fascinating. And you having that perspective of being a researcher, I'm sure really helps you in your role now with the investment community.
It does. It really does. Sometimes PhDs wonder, are you going to use your degree? And I have the argument that the degree is a way of thinking. And the way that I approach any kind of investment still has a lot to do with how do you run science? It's a hypothesis-driven world. And in the stage of investments that we work at, it's so risky that you have to still be working under hypotheses. You can't make a really de-risked investment at the earliest stages. So,
yeah. So Research Bridge Partners has kind of a unique gap that you fill, and a critical gap. You are investing in these biomedical startups, and you're looking for those breakthroughs. But you're really focused kind of in the middle of the country, and you'll fund on the East Coast and West Coast, but you're really kind of focused on those universities and those academics that are in the middle of the country. Can you talk about that and why that focus?
Sure. Well, I've spent a lot of time in the San Francisco Bay Area and dabbled up in Boston, and that's where most of the venture world for biomed and life sciences lives. And it is so energetic. There's the idea that you can walk to the coffee shop or go to your kids' sports games, run into somebody who's in somewhere in the ecosystem of biomedical innovation. It doesn't happen like that in other cities. So sometimes in San Diego, or maybe the Research Triangle in North Carolina, Seattle, they have a pretty big community. But if you're working, in West Lafayette, out of Purdue, or if you're in I mean, some of the areas are growing, but St. Louis or Ann Arbor, you have to make phone calls, you have to get on planes, you have to drive in order to really feel that ecosystem. So we wanted to figure out how to bring some of that ecosystem to the middle of the country. And so we call it a thinner ecosystem. So it's just a little thinner. I think there are a lot of ways to describe cities that aren't huge vehicles of innovation and venture funding, but we just call it thinner. And so we came up with this idea of creating a virtual hallway. So if you're an academic and you want to collaborate with someone, you can usually walk down the hall and ask some people some questions. Almost every faculty member in some of these dense networks, so at Stanford, UCSF, UC Berkeley, almost all of them have tried something commercial. So at least they have some network. Can't really do that at some of these other schools. So we wanted to make a virtual one. So, if you're working on something right now, maybe we could help connect you with somebody who's at a very similar stage or maybe a little farther along who could give you the right advice you need right now for someone who's working in one of these thinner commercialization areas. So we started there. And, a lot of what people were requesting was advice on IP strategy or connections to business talent. And so we started to create programming like how to hire a CEO or our program has just evolved out of what people have asked for. So this is the story I'm telling there. I find it interesting. I try to ingest the I-Core methodology, which is don't build something that people don't want. And so every time we talk to faculty, I listen and try to build something, especially if more than 10 ask for it, try to build something that everybody can learn from and benefit from. And so that's really the nonprofit's mission. We have this little tagline we use, which is it's not the IP, it's the PI. So we do care what technology is being made or what science is being done, but we care more that the people who are doing the work feel empowered enough to take it to the next step because they're so critical in moving it past the valley of death.
How do you find those people? Because researchers are interesting, right? Not all researchers are like you that were curious about launching a startup and trying to make that successful. Some want to research, but then they find themselves at this critical junction where they're kind of faced with, oh my goodness, this could be something, and they just can't let it go because there's no place to land it. And they, by default, become entrepreneurs. How do you find these people? What are their special characteristics you're looking for, attributes? Tell me about your methodology there.
Sure. Yeah. I think there's traditional ways, and I say traditional because a lot of venture works by reference and referral. So we do some of that. We ask the licensing offices at the universities who needs help, who has something interesting. You can ask other faculty who have they seen, who've been asking questions. You can ask other funders who do you want us to spend some time with, and but we've created another way, and I think it's not unique anymore. Maybe 8 years ago when we built it, it was, but a data model and uses a little bit of machine learning in there to amp up the power of it. But what we do is we look at the three pillars of what we're doing. So technology, the intellectual property, we look at the people, the PI, the lab, the students, the trainees, what they've done, the kind of awards they have won. So we found that NSF Career Awards are a pretty good indicator of later success. So the little proxies here. And then we look at the ecosystem. So the ecosystem can have a lot of different ways to think about it, but how many connections does an individual have to venture or to a contract research organization, which is where a lot of the research gets done after academia, or to somebody outside their field. So if it's a biomedical engineer working with a neuroscientist, that's a really interesting nexus. So finding people that know how to collaborate and have naturally formed collaborations outside of their own department, that's always a good indicator that they might be onto something innovative.
Yeah, and that's a skill that is sometimes very hard to pick up as a researcher. That doesn't come natural. Is that? Do you see that too? Do you see that there's some that are, more natural networkers and kind of curious as to what other people are doing? Or do you see that mostly it's a deliberate kind of growth of that network? Where do you think people kind of land in that?
I think it all comes down to trust, and building trust with somebody who's not in your department is hard. And even building trust within your own department or your own institution is sometimes a tough affair. Academia is a wonderful, wonderful place, and it also has its issues. So when you're asking a faculty member to build trust with someone from the business world, or a researcher in industry, there's a lot of hesitation. And having that convergence of those stakeholders together is really important to move innovation, but it just doesn't happen as naturally as you'd hope. So you have programs that build the incentives around this, or we have, as a nonprofit, have funded a business person to give advice over a series of months that hopefully builds enough trust for that faculty member and that business person to take it and endeavor forward. So you kind of removing that activation, lowering that activation energy, right? So that it can happen. It's a tough, nuanced business. It's a people business. So that's why I say we don't spend as much time on the technology as we do people. But a lot of times what people don't trust about one another is, are you being honest? And many times faculty hear from venture, you're too early. But what does that really mean? And some people that are really patient and care a lot about the science are able to instead say something like, I need to see you use this cell line instead of that cell line. But it takes a lot of effort, to be honest, to do the research to say, I need that cell line. So that's why it's hard work. If you're seeing thousands and thousands of deals a year, you won't be able to add that amount of value to every project. But if you try to be more specific or a little slower in your organization, or because we're a nonprofit, that's why we launched the nonprofit, is so that we wouldn't have to have that sense of urgency that a traditional fund has. Our fund is a program-related investment fund that's tethered to us, but it's not a traditional 2 in 20 fund, as they call it. So it's different. We can spend the time to look up exactly what needs to be done to move the technology forward, which then also moves the people forward. So you need to build that trust. And I think it's a lot of faculty have poor interactions with investors. It's just what happens. There are a lot of new investors in life sciences, especially after the pandemic. A lot more people are interested in investing in life sciences, which is great. More the merrier. But it definitely faculty need to understand who they're talking to and what kind of person they're talking to.
Yeah, and I would imagine the language or the taxonomy that's used are very different, and so it does take that time to really understand where each is coming from, as well as just the time horizon is very different, and that kind of communication is tough too, because sometimes if you're very future focused, you're seeing things that might come earlier, where the investment community sees things that are much closer that don't see those things as close. And I would imagine that there's conflict. There's conflict there. Can you expand a little bit more? You've talked a couple times about the different parts of the organization, that you've got a nonprofit and there's an investment side, and I believe you've told me that these two parts were kind of restructured. As you moved into the CEO role and others kind of changed their role. Can you explain that dynamic and why that's important, but also the relationship between the two parts?
Sure. Yeah. Well, this model is not new per se. So a foundation that runs an investment arm, been around for a very long time. InQtel is the one that I draw back, and Gates Foundation, probably the two. Ford Foundation. Those are the kind of ones that lay the groundwork for all of this going forward. But, having a nonprofit with a investment arm is something that needs to be well managed, and and everybody needs to understand the incentives and be in alignment with that. So the nonprofit is the GP, or the general partner of the program-related investment fund, and we have put terms on those investments that they need to be investments that the traditional venture community hasn't gotten interested in yet, usually because the science is too early or there's not a team surrounding it that's investable yet. And so we use that as catalytic money to then incentivize, trigger downstream investors. So the way that it's funded is foundations are the limited partners in the program-related investment fund. So you can think about there's, the time horizons on that are different than a traditional fund. We've also capped our return so that we're more in alignment with the founders, with the scientists. And it's a really perfect vehicle to do this stage of work. I really enjoy having that as a balance sheet option. Going forward, we've also, as you grow, you evolve, our personal skill sets have evolved. We're also now raising kind of a Series A fund, as they call it. That's a traditional fund, and it really will work to move some of these projects faster because we've noticed speed is an issue in engaging with coastal investors. So every time we feel like we've worked through an issue that the middle of the country has, we find another one. So we've been working through third-party validation of technology coming through academia with a prototype fund. And then we worked through how to find business talent because they weren't engaging. So we made this sort of dating how to hire a CEO program. And now we're working on speed. So you hear about, especially in 2021, there's a lot of money being spent in life sciences. And that was mostly not in the middle of the country. It was proportionally the same as it always has been. But that huge inflection of cash just didn't really hit in the middle. And the ability to react. So say if next month we heard some money was coming, I guarantee folks in the middle of the country wouldn't be able to circle the horses fast enough to catch it. It's just...
And why is that? Why is that?
Just working at a different pace. There's not as much urgency in the business side as there is in Boston. I feel like if you have folks that haven't spent time in Boston or San Francisco don't really understand that speed, which is fine. We just, they don't have professional data rooms ready. So it's very reactive. They get a call from someone and then they build the data room, right? So it's a little more reactive than we would hope, or they have one pitch deck instead of several pitch decks for different audiences. So it's just a different speed. And so if a deal looks like it's about ready for coastal funding, we try and make sure that it looks a lot like what it should before they approach them.
Yeah. I know you've talked to a couple of our Toffler scholars, and that we have identified as it's kind of getting ready for something, right? They're preparing, they're working through their technology, and it may be ready for another look or, expansion or, evolution there. And they come away with a sense of, oh, wow, didn't know I needed to know these things. And I didn't realize there's this whole other world on the other side looking at my research inside a larger, ecosystem or marketplace, and that you have information and data and guidance that they didn't even know existed. In one case, I had a conversation very recently with one of them that you've spoken to, and they said, we've added a level of focus to our research that we would have never understood. And it's making us better. It's making us, more focused, because there'll be a landing place for this if we get this right. And that's very exciting. Given your experience, and you said, it didn't work out for you. What guidance do you give to these researchers that either early in their career, these just standing up their labs, or even more experienced researchers that are already assistant professors? What guidance or mentoring do you give them that they should be kind of aware of to help their research actually make a difference and not just stay in a lab.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, it's great to hear that there was some positive feedback on some of these meetings. Sometimes I don't get to hear it. So, you know, my goal would be to help each faculty member build a mechanism within their lab so that they can create a way. So maybe a framework or decision tree, some way that they can help their trainees and their students and their research in their lab understand which projects might have potential and why. It's hard for academics to constantly rely on third parties outside of the university to give them perspective. Because especially in the middle of the country, they may have 1, 2, or 3 of those meetings a year. And that's really not enough to be able to give perspective on what's going on. And so if we could help them create those instincts themselves within their labs, that's the ultimate goal. But when I've talked to, actually, I talked to another one of your awardees just this week, try to make sure they know what resources are out there. So on the government side, you have a lot of exciting activity in the SBIR, STTR program. That's the grants for startups. And then you have some that are for academia. So the NSF has a program called PFI, and that's an I-Corps. Those are the 2 big ones they have. And then ARPA-H is the newest NIH program, and it's creating a lot of excitement and new programs being funded in different ways. So just making sure folks know that these are out there is the first step. And because they're grants, and that's very digestible by academics. And then I start to go through what else is out there, because there's so many different ways to raise money. And you just heard me say how much I enjoy having multiple balance sheets. I can spend them in different ways and have impact in different ways. And I know that academic labs, can also ingest money from different types of funders, and that gives them flexibility. So you can't spend academic grants on CROs typically in large quantities. So you need foundations, family offices, some other groups in order to supplement that work and make sure that that what they're building goes forward. And then you start interacting with angels and venture, which means you need to have a startup. And the startup then takes equity-based investments, which you can then use as sponsored research into your academic lab on specific terms. Of course, intellectual property stays with the startup. But, there are a lot of different ways to structure financing to move science. And so I try to slowly walk them through all of those different options, but also what are the consequences and incentive structures that will change in their lab by taking different types of money. So academics have conflicts, and they need to manage those conflicts very carefully. So that's where I spend a lot of time. And I find some faculty are just, they're so aware of their conflicts that they don't want to do anything. But it's managing conflicts. It's not yes or no. It's, I have a conflict, I'm going to declare it, and I know that it's not something that will persuade someone in my lab from not graduating. That's the most important part of maintaining what academia is this academic structure of training people and creating science for what it should be. The commercialization side needs to get done, but it's not the core of what academia is, and it shouldn't be treated as that. It should be, we need to protect it and make sure that what's happening, everybody knows what's happening around the commercialization side.
Yeah. There's that conflict inside of the funding models and just keeping everything straight. But I would, back to your comment about trust too, learning how to do that in having all those different models inside your lab. That's a very different kind of trust. If it's singularly focused, if you're just taking government money, NIH money, that's very different. But if you're taking and you're using resources from other places, there's a different kind of trust and communication that has to happen. And it's probably for everybody.
Yeah, I think academics tend to think about science, but if they're close to the clinic, so if they're clinicians and physicians, they think about the patient a lot. And so it's sometimes hard for them to understand that the commercialization infrastructure doesn't value whatever area they're focused in as much as they do. So, for instance, we've been working with a lab that is really focused on multiple sclerosis, MS. And, that's wonderful. We need more hits on that one. But venture right now, and they have a neuroprotective antibody, it also could work for ALS. And that is an area that is moving faster towards commercialization and has a lot more sinkhole at the end of the rainbow. If we're St. Patty's Day thinking of the rainbow, there's a bigger pot of gold right now. So, thinking strategically about launching this company that they're forming, ALS is probably the first lead that they should go for, because it would create a supported startup that would then allow a lot of the MS work to go at speed as well. So creating these portfolios is something that I don't think individual faculty and clinicians spend as much time on, but is what venture spends a lot of time on. So trying to understand portfolio construction within a startup is something, that I would want them to learn how to do themselves. But if not, because it's a capability set, we then gave a grant to the academic to learn how to handle ALS cells. It's just a practical thing. They just needed to learn how to do it. And they did, of course. Took a couple months. But they just had to learn how to run those assays. And so they did. But it definitely was one of these hurdles we had to overcome in terms of trying to help shape the company itself, but with the people in mind. They had to trust us that we were saying something that made sense, right?
So has that changed with our increased knowledge? And I probably won't ask this question quite right or word this question quite right, but it seems like the more we understand, our bodies and our minds and our brains and just the systems of systems, if you would, of the human, there is a lot of cross understanding. But in that cross understanding, there seems to be a lot of cross kind of applications. I've heard this from our researchers that a drug for, a certain kind of dementia may work for another kind of disease, or, something that might be going on in the circulatory system and, might apply to something in the brain. Is that increasing, that kind of cross collaboration and cross understanding, ultimately leading to this need for a portfolio perspective? Or has it always been this way?
It hasn't always been this way, but you hear a lot about delivery being the issue for some technologies now instead of the mechanism. So yes, I mean, you could targeting the brain is still very difficult. The blood-brain barrier is a barrier. It's an issue for getting therapies up there. But there are new ways of tagging molecules and antibodies or modifying them so that they can pass the blood-brain barrier. But what's happening in cells, especially in cancers or some of the other neurodegenerative, it's often similar or pathways that are going awry. Similar pathways are going awry in the cell. So some of the therapies are targeting the same pathways, and so you can retool what's going on for a different disease. And for almost any industry, if there's more than one application for a technology or an innovation, they run into the problem of boiling the ocean, is what we call it, which is, you try to do everything at once. And you just can't do that. You can't run 6 different preclinical pathways, preclinical, models at the same time. And you can't run 6 different phase 1s at the same time. It just doesn't work. There's not enough money in the world for that. You have to start somewhere and then use one to support the other as you build that portfolio and grow it. And because of that, once you ask an individual to focus, then they have to do the work of figuring out where they want to start. And then you run into analysis paralysis. So it's just too much work to pick one. So, a lot of different ways to figure out where you want to start. You can ask advice from key opinion leaders. You can try and figure out where the funding is. So go towards where the funding is. A lot of people rely on market sizes, but that for me, that's not as a good indicator of where to go. And some people just want to stick with the science and say, I've already taken the science this far with this one, so we're going to go first with this one. And that's a bet, it's a gamble.
So how is the outlook for funding? You said there's an increase of funding in life science and biomedical kind of research. What is the outlook that, from your perspective, in the next 3 to 5 years, and where is money being spent, and where might it be spent for the future?
Mm. It's an interesting question because if you look in the press, there's hot and cold right now. So, like I said, in 2021, there was a lot of investment into startups and in the life sciences. And not all of them are making it to their later rounds, their later stage rounds. And so there's quite a bit of closing up of shops and closing programs down. And it's all very difficult. And it's hard on the patients who were looking at those clinical trials for success. It's hard on the scientists who were really devoting their time. And it's hard on the investors because they're going to have some losses and then probably not invest in that space again for a few years. So in general, this is all happening. But at the same time, government's putting a lot of money in, same amount and a little bit more than they have in the past, a little up every year. And then corporate venture and corporate business development is spending a lot of money. So there have been some big hits in the last couple of years. The COVID vaccine made quite a bit of money for several people, several groups. The new Novo Nordisk and Lilly, they've made quite a bit of money recently off of Wegovy and some of the other GLP-1. So a lot of people are buying or spending money in supporting cardiometabolic, which is diabetes and heart and some of these other spaces. Still a lot of money being spent in cancer, as always. And then neuro. So, neuro is this kind of last unknown in the human body. So there's a lot of excitement on understanding it. There are some really cool combos of device and therapeutic that are coming together, which is not as common as it once was. So in that, it's really exciting for someone like me to see how the FDA would react and how we can all come together as an ecosystem to support these new, really impactful technologies that are coming. So these are all really nice places to spend some time and think on how there are some ways that academia is just productive and they kind of rely on investors to just take what they have and move. But in some ways, academics could look at what's happening and say, I can fit in that space. I can actually change a little bit some of my research to say, oh, I can work in cardiometabolic for a couple of years. So, there is some reactivity that could be on the side of the academics to what's coming.
So you're excited about the neuroscience and some of the promise, I guess, of what's being done today. Am I picking that up correctly?
Oh, sure. The technology, so remember I told you about sequencing was really what pushed me into genomics. And that was the right time. The early 2000s was the right time to be doing genomics. It was really exciting. Right now in the brain, we're able to measure and visualize and read where we haven't ever in the past. The tools have now met our ability to study in that area of the body. And so it's just really fascinating. I heard a pitch the other day that they've broken the sound barrier of resecting nerves together. I think it was 5 centimeters they could go between fixing a nerve that had broken. And that's for a really long way at the really small level. So it's just really inspiring to work in this space. And I think because more and more people are aging, it's becoming more of a space folks want to spend money in. And that just aligns really well with where the technology is to support the science.
And you also mentioned that collaboration and partnerships are very important in getting some of this funding. Do you partner with other organizations, other nonprofits? How do you do that when you're supporting, your mission and your focus and your portfolio of people?
Sure. I think, convergence, as I said that earlier, convergence is just really important. And this is a space where a lot of people can make a lot of money. And so there's always this how do we pay for what we need to get done? Because it's a very expensive space to work in. And collaborating as foundations and nonprofits and with government to really make sure that folks that don't have really big balance sheets right away are able to access elite resources is important. And so we spend our time on that. I think corporate innovation is doing a pretty good job of reaching out or being responsive and saying, this is the kind of experimental design we would need in order to say your data package is ready for us to look at. And so they're doing their part. And I think venture is diversifying. So there are every venture group you look at, honestly, is a little bit different. It's hard for, I think, academics to realize that every venture group is actually really different. But, because of that, there's more space for everyone, in my opinion. So everybody has a different model for how much ownership they want and how much time they're going to spend on the company. And I think it's somewhat of a dating process for the academic to realize their own personal incentives. How much time do they want to spend? Which then dictates which venture group is the best match for them.
So looking back on the 8 years that you've been doing this and kind of in this, this capacity, are there any stories that and successes that, or even, failures, because sometimes those are the greatest learnings, but those moments that you're most proud of, those stories that you're most proud of where you were working together, collaborating, getting something, out there. Is there anything that you would like to share there?
Yeah, there's so many good ones, right? So how would you pick? But we recently had one of our portfolio companies go public last summer. And if you were to have asked me a couple of years ago, I would have said that wasn't going to be one of the big shiny stars. And I think it was not because of the science, and it was because of the business team. And we couldn't find somebody to really lead it for very long. And this has to be a partnership between a scientist and the business community, or it just doesn't move. And so we finally found, the right person to take it forward, and it was a rocket trajectory. So that was a really fun one to see them. That what we've been trying to say, that you need to find somebody in the business world that's as good as you are at science. It really is true. You need to find. So some of the faculty we work with are the best in the world at what they're doing. They need to find the business person that is that person for them. And it takes a lot of work and it takes time. And sometimes you have to date a lot of people to find that one, but it really does make a difference. And so that event really solidified for me that we are spending our time and money in the right place and trying to form these relationships. And so a lot of people say, why can't you just give us money and go away? Because that's a pretty common statement. And because that's not what I think the ecosystem needs as much as a really rich partnership between individuals to move the technologies and the innovations.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I imagine it's the same with just trying to find that business partner. You can't just give that business partner to the researcher. They have to be a part of that because it goes back to that trust and that understanding and that time commitment to get to know each other and get to know each other's language. And that's great. So what are you most hopeful when you look out 5 to 10 years? What are you most hopeful for in this kind of convergence of early research and investment and commercialization?
I think the types of diseases that we're going to be able to address and cure, the rare diseases, there's just an unlimited power that's coming with AI and the different types of devices that we're building and the therapeutics that we're able to design now. It's just, I think we're going to see a lot of movement in some of the areas that historically haven't been well served by medicine. Hopefully the prices are able to stay accessible, but pricing on these is what it is to make sure that the engine keeps moving back in the beginning. So I think we're going to really see some really interesting gene therapies and cell therapies and some of these really technical solutions to some of the diseases that we have. It's just, I can't believe we're living and we're able to have these kind of really specific fixes. So it's really exciting to see it. And I just want to see how it's going to really spread and make sure that everybody gets access to it at some point.
Yeah, that's you painted a wonderful picture. Are there things that you wish we would have discussed that we didn't touch upon, especially as your role of leading this organization and in the industry?
No, I think when we're thinking through how to bring everybody together to tackle these solutions, there's some methods that have worked in the past that I don't know if we want to keep reinforcing. And I think there could be a big discussion on what kind of policies that universities have or that government has that are slowing us down instead of helping us. Of course, they were all started in good spirit, but they might be aging out. I mean, some of the university policies are really preventing science from moving, and some of the government policies that right now are coming out are attacking intellectual property in ways that it's never been attacked before. So, policy really does have an impact on how we move science. And then on the investment side, I think investors, there are so many of us now. It's been an explosion of new investors. And I think everyone needs to really take a moment to think through how we're having conversations with faculty, because they're staying for 30, 40 years. And the investors typically are not. They're jumping into one of their portfolio companies. They're coming back out to do some more investments. So the one-off moments that they're having with faculty need to be better thought through, because this is a person who might never speak to an investor again because of the one moment they had that was negative. So I want to have more conversations like that with other investors to make sure they know the kind of impact they're having on these people that are going to be robust engines of innovation over the next decades, right?
Yeah, I think the conversation, I think that's a wonderful conversation to have. I think the conversation around kind of that obsolete process and mindset and methodologies, whatever they may be, inside our organizations is really important. We're very different than we were 30, 40, 50 years ago. And, you still need the checks and the balance. You still need, the oversight, and you still need some time. Sometimes you just can't react really quickly, but some of this is not value added anymore. And we need to have those, that serious discussion. So Lydia, as we wrap up here, how can people reach you? We talked about it's important to talk and collaborate. How can people reach you and contact you?
Sure. The website has a web form, which of course people wonder if anyone's on the other end, and there are people on the other end. researchbridgepartners.org. You can also find me on LinkedIn. So one of our founders and early investors, Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn. So I'm always trying to talk up LinkedIn, but I am very active on it. So it's always Lydia McClure. You can send a connection.
That's great. I very much appreciate our relationship. It's a growing relationship that's happened over the last year, and I've learned a lot from you, and will continue to learn a lot from you. And appreciate your time today and sharing your perspective and your excitement and just that passion that I hear in your voice. So, and the love for the research and the people doing it. So I very much appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thanks, Deb. Same here.
Thank you for joining Research Renaissance. For more information and to stay updated, subscribe for more episodes and visit our website at tofflertrust.org. Feel free to call us if you have any thoughts, suggestions, or just want to find out more about the Karen Toffler Charitable Trust. Until we meet again, onward and upward.